All right. Morning. Here's section 2. I'm not sure how much we're going to get through. It's a pretty long section, but we're going to fast forward kind of quickly through it. First thing I want you to do is make a chart. I guess you could just write all these down. They're nowhere on the notes, but we made a big chart at the bottom of our last page of section 2. And it is all of these things. So I want you to write these down. Makes a great essay question. So I'm just going to pause for a few seconds so you can pause this and write it all down. Go. All right, to briefly go through these. Great Britain's strength was everything we've talked about so far. If you wanted to go into war with the right stuff, England had it all. They'd been fighting global wars for 300 years. They were used to fighting the French, who were the other world power. So they have cannons and navies and a huge army and well-trained and money coming out their ears. As a matter of fact, they're going to buy entire armies called the Hessians for the war. They're going to just rent German armies. They have everything you want. And in Great Britain, or America, has nothing. We're going to talk about that in a second. Problems they did have, though. If you look here, they're going to have a really hard time reacting to anything. If they want to change tactics, they got to get permission. So they got to send a note home to England 6 weeks by sea. They got to make decisions there and send the answer back 6 weeks by sea. Meanwhile, Americans can make decisions quickly and implement them quickly because we don't have that travel time in there. Great Britain's strategies are terrible. They still stand in a big square formation and expect us to fight them in an open field. Great Britain, their big problem as far as their goals are that they have to crush us. It's on them to win. If after we declare independence, if nobody did anything, America wins. Great Britain has to destroy our will. They have to make us never want to even consider doing this again, because not only is it about us, but it's about teaching the rest of the world not to do this. So we need to become an example of why you don't declare independence against Great Britain. And then we've talked before about England's red coat uniforms. It makes them really easy to kill in the wilderness. It makes them really easy to find. It makes them really easy to see from a distance, which means that they're never going to sneak up on us ever. But that's not their thing. Their thing is to find us and beat the crap out of us. American strengths aren't much. We have really good leaders, not because they're experienced, but because they're flexible. England's dealing with this 300-year-old manual, and this is how you fight a war. America hasn't done any of that, so we can do whatever we want. We don't have a tradition. We don't have a way that we do things. We get during sea captains. We'll talk about that later. Our citizens are very dedicated. The ones that, very few Americans were patriots at the time, but the ones that were willing to give everything to the war effort. We know the terrain. This is going to come in handy over and over and over again because we're going to have to retreat. And if you want to retreat, you need to know where the hidey holes are. And we know those. Flexible fighting tactics and the fact that our soldiers were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for their families. They were fighting to make the world a better place. And that makes them more willing to die for their cause. The British soldiers were fighting for a paycheck. They were fighting because the king told them to. That makes them a little less willing to die for their cause. So when it comes down to battle, especially near the end of the war, the British are more likely to run and just surrender. So what does America lack? Everything. We don't even have money. Congress has made paper money that nobody wants. Our soldiers don't even have boots. We're going to rely on donated weapons, and eventually the French are going to sneak some into us. Our soldiers have no idea what they're doing. They're just militias. They don't even know how to make a camp. I mean, they know they've camped out by themselves, but they don't know how to make like a soldier camp where you're worried about where the human waste goes, and you're worried about making sure you don't get diseases and stuff. They don't know how to do any of that stuff. So we're just in trouble all around. So there's a section focus question. Where'd you go? Come on now. Section focus question at the beginning, right down here. How are the early years of the war a critical time? Put that at the beginning of the notes. The beginning of the war is do or die. And luckily we're going to survive. The first thing we have to deal with is New York City. We kicked England out of Boston. They took their troops. They took their massive fleet. They left Boston and they went for the second most important American city, which is which is New York. If we're going to protect Boston, we can't also protect New York. If we're going to protect New York, we can't also attack Boston. We have one tiny army, no navy. So Great Britain just says, fine, you want Boston, we'll take New York. Washington actually finds out they're going to try and take New York and marches down to New York and gets there before the British because they're so slow moving. But the problem is, New York Harbor is the best harbor in the world. It's tons and tons of coastline. Washington has 19,000 men, and he has no cannons, which means he cannot prevent the British from landing. You need cannons to do that. He has to just try to predict where they will land and stop them from landing. And he has less troops than the British. The British bring with them Sir William Howe is going to be their leader. He's pretty decent at what he does. 34,000 well-trained troops, which is almost twice as many as George Washington has. They've got hundreds of ships, 10,000 sailors. They can land anywhere they want. And what the British literally can do and choose to do is they sail into New York Harbor, they look for George Washington, and they go somewhere else. There is so much coastline in New York City that Washington didn't have a chance. So Washington puts his armies in like 3 different spots, the most likely spots for them to land. Great Britain goes somewhere else, and then attacks the Americans. And the Revolutionary Army, the Continental Army, has no choice. A few of them volunteer, a few hundred volunteer to stay behind and delay for the British, and they give up their lives. And the American army, the Continental Army, sneaks off in the middle of the night, kind of literally running away scared in the middle of the night. From that point forward, Washington takes the Continental Army and just runs. In order to keep the revolution alive, Washington has to keep his army alive. If the main Continental Army is lost, the war is probably over. Okay? So he knows that he can lose a battle as long as he doesn't lose his army. So Washington moves all over the place, just avoiding the British. Now, how is he able to keep one step ahead of them? Spies. They got great spies. They know everywhere Great Britain's going to go. And he's just, it's like when you're a little kid and your big brother or sister punches you, or you punch your bigger brother or sister, and then you spend all this time like trying to stay on the opposite side of the end table from them, or the opposite side of the table, just so nobody can hit each other. That's exactly what George Washington is doing. He just got to stay out of the British hands, okay? And they fight a bunch of small battles, but Washington always gets away. And that's his brilliance, is he knows I can't lose my army. So he never fights the British, not in a major battle. The little skirmishes here and there, but he doesn't line up in a big open field and lose his army. And he keeps running away. So he moves north to White Plains, New York. And then he gets chased down there. And he pushes over into New Jersey, which is down here. And this shows you how desperate he is, because nobody in America wants to spend time in New Jersey. But he ends up in New Jersey. After the British take New York, they get a hold of a good portion of our spy network. One of the leaders is a guy named Nathan Hale, who very famously says, I only regret that I have but one life to give for my country. They get a hold of part of our spy network, and they put a lot of them to death. And so that's going to hamper us a little bit moving forward. And he's just really famous for his quote. He basically says, look, I do it again. I do it again and again and again. I'm not repenting of being a spy. So Washington spends the entire last 6 months of 1776, after the Declaration of Independence, after he loses New York, just running and running and running and running. And he knows he has to get a win before the winter, because the men are going to go home. They don't fight during the winter back then because the guns don't work very well, and also it's cold out there. So they don't fight in the winter. The British can go hunker down in the cities and the forts and party it out for the whole winter. America doesn't have that choice. Washington knows if they don't get a win by winter, the army's just going to disappear. They're going to go home. They got to support their families. They're not getting paid. They got to go support their families. They got to take care of their farms. They got to take care of everything. He's got to get a win in order to make them realize that they have a chance. So he's in Pennsylvania, right across the border from New Jersey, and he knows I got to get a win, and I can't beat them. I can't beat the British, and they can't capture me. So my only choice is, when you can't win the game, but you have to play the game, you cheat. And George Washington absolutely cheats. We'll call it a daring plan, but he breaks all of the rules. He waits till Christmas Day, gets his troops lined up. He knows that the British will be drunk because it's Christmas. And the British soldiers that weren't in England were always given a triple ration of rum on Christmas because they were so far away from their families. And of course, there was not going to be a battle. Nobody fights in the winter. So they always got a triple ration of rum. The British soldiers, actually these are German mercenaries, get super drunk, pass out on Christmas, and Washington ferries 2,400 men across the Delaware River. attacks the German mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey, and takes them captive, and a huge victory for the Americans. It's their first victory since the war started. And it's not, I mean, it's cheating. It's in every way it's cheating. It's Christmas Day. You don't attack on Christmas Day, Christmas night. You're not attacking people in combat. But we needed the win, and this is the only way to stay in the war. They take the city of Trenton. They capture thousands of what are called Hessians. Hessians are German mercenaries. The German states, Hesse, Prussia, Westphalia is one of them, would just rent out their armies. They didn't need them, and they were really well trained, extremely well trained. So European countries would rent them. That's how much money England has. They rented entire armies. So we capture thousands and thousands of them, and we send them home. But now we got a problem because Great Britain knows where we are, and that we're cut off. There's very few troops. Washington can't leave by a river. He's super vulnerable there, and the British have a fleet that they can sail up the river. So he's got to get away, and he knows that the British are going to come for him. So he actually lights a huge circle of campfires to make it look like his troops were camped out. The British come in, march in to take him on, and he's already left once again by night. This is kind of going to be his plan, is only going to leave by night. So General Burgoyne gets put in charge with a new plan. It's brilliant. He knows that George Washington only has one main army, the Continental Army. There's a couple little ones floating around. He's got one main army. If they capture the army, war is over. So he decides he's going to attack the army from 3 different directions. Then Washington can fight against one. He can capture it with the other 2. It's pretty smart, especially when you have superior forces, a superior number of forces. You've got way more stuff. Attack from a few different directions. So the goal is to take Albany. If we go back here, you'll find Albany is right here. This is Albany. If you control Albany and you control New York City, you control the border, and that cuts off New England. And they considered New England the head of the snake. If we can take out New England, the rest of the country won't fight anymore. Like, this is where all of the willpower, this is where all of the momentum is. It's where Boston is. So if we can cut off New England, America won't be able to reinforce them anymore because they'd have to go by land. They don't have a navy. They'd have to go by land, and England would control this land route. So they're hoping to starve out New England and take out New England and end the war that way. So Burgoyne comes from 3 different directions, 3 different armies. Washington can only defend against one. So if they surround the colonial army and take it, the war's over. If Washington finds out and doesn't go north and is smart and doesn't stop them, then they take Albany and they cut off New England. Either way, it's a win. So they're going to come in from Canada in the north, right past Fort Ticonderoga, which doesn't have any cannons anymore. They're going to come one from the west, from out of Fort Detroit, out of America, which is now considered part of Canada. And now, at this point it was Canada, and now, of course, it's Michigan. And then William Howe is going to come up from New York City. The guy that just took New York City is going to come up. Well, the whole plan falls apart because of poor communication. If you're going to have this many moving parts, they have to be able to communicate with each other, and American spies got a hold of some of their moves. And even without that, they have a problem because the King of England goes against his own commander and tells General Howe, go take Philadelphia. The king could care less about Albany, New York. The king's angry with Philadelphia because that's where the Declaration of Independence came out of. So it's like a symbolic victory for the king. If he takes Philadelphia, the place where America declared independence, then he wins, right? So he takes one of those armies and says, look, Washington has to go defend Albany, so you go take Philadelphia. Well, Howe takes his army. He goes to Philadelphia, and he actually fails to take Philadelphia. The army from the west out of Detroit gets cut off by a guy named Benedict Arnold, and then it gets destroyed. So Burgoyne, with the main force, actually smaller than Washington's, right? Each army of the 3 was smaller than Washington's, but if you add them up, it was way bigger. Burgoyne comes marching in right from the north, stops at Fort Ticonderoga, takes it real quick, marches south, and meets Washington full on, and Washington actually beats Burgoyne in the first real win, where they didn't sneak up on a bunch of drunk Germans. So this is a huge victory. In the next video, we'll talk about how this is going to change everything for the Americans. Ceremonially, I mean, it's nice to have control of the land route, right? It's nice to have control of Albany. But this was a strategic minor victory, but it's going to open up a whole lot of things for us in the war, and that'll be where we start the notes next. Email me if you have any questions.